So Joshua came upon them suddenly, having marched all night from Gilgal. And the Lord threw them into a panic before Israel, who struck them with a great blow at Gibeon and chased them by the way of the ascent of Beth Horon, and struck them as far as Azekah and Makkedah. And as they fled before Israel, while they were going down the ascent of Beth Horon, the Lord threw down large stones from heaven on them, and as far as Azekah, and they died. There were more men, who died because of the hailstones than the sons of Israel with the sword. At that time, Joshua spoke to the Lord in the day when the Lord gave the Amorites over to the sons of Israel, and he said in the sight of Israel, "Sun, stand still at Gibeon, and moon in the valley of Ajalon." And the sun stood still, and the moon stopped upon the nation until the nation took vengeance on their enemies. Is this not written in the book of Jeshar? The sun stopped in the midst of the heaven and did not hurry to set for about a whole day. There has been no day like it before or since, when the Lord heeded the voice of a man, for the Lord fought for Israel. So Joshua returned, and all Israel with him, to the camp of Gilgal. We'll actually stop at 15. I may have said 16. So the sun stands still. This incredible miracle, this act of God to preserve the day. We'll get to that in just a minute. So the king of Jerusalem hears about the Israel demolishing Jericho and Ai, and how the Gibeonites became allies with Israel. So here's where I start asking you questions. How did the king feel about this alliance that Gibeon had formed with Israel? How do you feel about it? He wasn't happy. Why was he not happy? Say it again. Okay, so he wanted them. What is said about the Gibeon? It's a big city. It's full of warriors. Every man was a warrior. That's a stacked city. This is a big place. We'll read more about some other cities. So this is a big city. That would be a great ally for anybody. So what did the king decide to do? He got some help. So he gathered up in a collective of 5 kings with a bunch of names that are difficult to pronounce, and they all band together to go take the Gibeonites out. So they target Gibeon, the people of Gibeon. Now, why would they? This is just kind of a thought question, so I need some participation. Why would they want to take them out? Why would they want to take Gibeon out instead of try to make allies with them? Okay. Want them to surrender, to be on their side. So anything to maybe weaken this untouchable Israel might be an effort there. So how is Gibeon going to take on this army of conjoined kings, all these kings together? What is Gibeon's approach? They know what's going on, that they're going to be overtaken, or that they're a target rather. So what do the Gibeonites do? Who do they turn to? They turn to these new allies they just acquired. They go to Joshua. Help us out. We need some help. We read in verse 6. And, Israel has just been duped. Joshua has just been tricked to where now they have this kind of baggage of these allies where they could be helpful, but it's not really what God wanted ultimately, but the Lord makes it work. So Joshua really has an out here. He could let the Gibeonites just, drift away and be taken care of. But what does Joshua do? What's his response to this? He takes care of them, doesn't he? He marches all night and surprises the enemy in verse 9. He requests that the Gibeon, we see he makes this request for the Gibeonites, and God speaks to Joshua here in verse 8 and speaks in this past tense way of speaking again. In verse 8 it says, "Do not fear them, for I have given them into your hands." So the victory is already won because God decided. It just takes the men going into battle. The Lord slaughtered these 5 kings in the army. He tells them that's what's going to do, what's going to happen. So this amazing thing happens before the sun stops. God intervenes with this battle, and how does God take care of these enemies? What way does He punish them physically? I'm hearing stones quietly whispered around the audience. Stones. Giant hailstones come from heaven, come down, and large enough to destroy people. How many? It doesn't give an exact number. What quantity is there? Yeah, more than the sword took care of the Israelites actually killed with the sword. I work for Thompson Roofing. Adam works for half of the employees of Thompson worship here. Boy, that'd be a hailstorm that would be beneficial to the company, I think. So this incredible way of wiping out these people has started with God sending these giant stones, hailstones, obliterating people. It's a real gory way of getting things done. So then Joshua goes on and he calls out to God, he prays to God, makes this request. And what does he ask God in verse 12 and 13? He asks God, but he addresses something else. Speak up, come on. Sun and moon, stand still. What a request. Maybe the biggest favor to ever ask. Could we pause the solar system for just a little bit so that we can take care of this? It's an interesting thing that came to Joshua's mind of, let's stop this. So God fulfills the request of His people to the level of stopping the solar system. Verse 14, notice how God did this graciously. Why did He do it? What does verse 14 say? Say it again. Okay. He says, I was looking for the Lord heeded the voice of a man. So that says a lot about our requests to God, that God does listen to those who follow Him. Mentions the book of Jesher. This is the idea of a historical book of songs talking about victories of God's people. It's referenced again in 2 Samuel, talking about King David. So the sun stood still, elongating the day and lengthening time for that Joshua needed. But also, it was really discouraging for the Amorites, unable to hide. There was nowhere for a natural time, a natural break, nowhere to rest. Have you ever said, "This is just the longest day of my life"? They could legitimately say that. If we can't get a break, can't catch a break. All right. Any other thoughts or questions or anything until we move on? Yeah, Tracy's talking about how this relationship between Israel and God is really becoming really dynamic, between God telling them exactly what to do, Israelites doing essentially, I won't say nothing, but not raising a sword at Jericho, and then how God instructs them how to take care of Ai, and now God really intervening and being a part of that with the hailstorms and hailstones and other things, and how that will continue. His intervention and instruction will continue. Hmm.
By faith, by grace through faith, not of works. In other words, they were trusting God, but God was the one giving the victory. And the not of works doesn't mean that they didn't have to do anything, but it's just showing the ultimate basis for the victory. God pushed those walls down, but they still had to walk around. God, like here, was giving them the victory and the cities, but they still had to obey God. So again, not of works doesn't mean you don't have to do anything. You just have to do what God says. You have to trust Him. But He is by His grace. He's the one giving the victory.
That's very good. Brent's talking about Ephesians 2, how it's by grace through faith. Yeah, they still have to, they're still an instrument. It's not a blind faith. There's definitely instruction by God, and God is ultimately the winner of all of these things. But we have to be an instrument, just as Joshua and the Israelites were, to fulfill what God has told them to do. Cameron?
I've seen with this story sometimes you'll see as a Post article about NASA has seen an extra day missing or something like that. And it sounds amazing, you know. And I've even heard it in a Bible class before at another career. And you have to be really, really, really careful about seeing stories like that and not researching them and realizing if they're true or not. And of course, that one is not true about finding an extra day. It's part of the story.
Yeah. Yeah, I've heard that before too. All right, we'll move on here. Verse 16 through 27. So we're talking about these 5 kings that king of Jerusalem gathered together. And after the hailstorm, after the sun has stood still, these 5 kings fled and hid themselves in the cave of Makkedah. Sorry if I'm mispronouncing that. And it was told to Joshua, the 5 kings have been found hid in the cave of Makkedah. And Joshua said, roll large stones against the mouth of the cave and set men by it to guard them. Do not stay there yourselves. Pursue your enemies. Attack their rear guard. Do not let them enter the cities. The Lord your God has given them into your hand. When Joshua and the sons of Israel had finished striking them with great blows until they were wiped out, and when the remnant that remained of them had entered into the fortified cities, then all the people returned safe to Joshua in the camp of Makkedah. Not a man moved his tongue against any of the people of Israel. Then Joshua said, open the mouth of the cave and bring those 5 kings out to me from the cave. And they did so, and they brought those 5 kings out from the cave to the king of Jerusalem, the king of Hebron, the king of Jarmuth, the king of Lachish, the king of Eglon. And when they brought those kings out to Joshua, Joshua summoned all the men of Israel and said to the chiefs of the men of war who had gone with him, come near, put your feet on the necks of these kings. Then they came near and put their feet on their necks. And Joshua said to them, do not be afraid or dismayed. Be strong and courageous, for the Lord will do to all your enemies against whom you fight. And afterward Joshua struck them and put them to death. And he hanged them on 5 trees. And they hung on the trees until evening. But at the time of the going down of the sun, Joshua commanded, and they took them down from the trees and threw them into the cave where they had hidden themselves. And they set large stones against the mouth of the cave, which remained to this very day. So these 5 kings survived this extra long day and survived the day so far, and they retreated. So where did they go? Said it about 6 times in that passage. They hid in a cave. So they hid in the cave of Makkedah. I'm not sure how to say that, but what did Joshua have done to this cave? So the 5 kings are in there. Men say, hey, the kings are in there. So what does Joshua do? Giant stone in front of it and seals them up. They're kind of in prison there for a little while. And so the Israelites go back to kind of finish off the war, and once everyone had been destroyed, they come back. They come back to the cave. Just before then, verse 21, this verse is really moving. Not a man moved his tongue against any of the people of Israel. Because of God and the people the enemies had no words or nowhere to hide, nothing to say. Both the mouth of the enemies and the cave were shut. It's just really powerful. There's probably a really good poetic way of saying their mouths were shut and the caves were shut, but they couldn't even say anything of just how fantastic the Israelites did by following God. So the Israelites go back to slaughter the Amorites, and Joshua releases the cave container and brings the kings out. And so what did Joshua have done once the 5 kings were out in custody? It's kind of POWs here. So, right, he brings these chief of the men of war, so kind of these generals essentially, and they put their feet on the necks of these kings. And Joshua empowers these Israelites by quoting God, something he's heard from God. Do not be afraid. Be strong and courageous. Just kind of emboldens them and gets them to have this amazing visual of having their feet on the necks of these their enemies, which were once great leaders, are now presumably on the ground, literally under the feet of Israel. And you think about how submissive and humiliating that would be. You see in movies or shows or whatever, and someone claims a territory or they're proud, they put their foot up, put their foot down. You're kind of claiming what's below your feet, and that's exactly what's going on here. So he goes on, he kills them. It seems that he kills them first, and then hangs them on a tree until the sun finally sets on this day. And then it says he threw them into the cave, another sign of humiliation. They weren't buried or anything. Threw them into the cave, and I really like how the Waldrons have it in their book. It says, "So the place they had sought for refuge became their grave." So the very place where they went and hid now became their final resting place. And it says they stacked up stones, and that's where they were to this day. So just a quick note, it's not until the beginning of Judges where Judah actually destroys Jerusalem. They just destroyed the king of Jerusalem, the original king of Jerusalem, and it's not until Judges 1 that they actually take over that city. Any other comments about the sun standing still, 5 kings, the cave, feet on necks?
Yeah, Michael, when you think of the iniquity of the Ammonites, Abraham was promised a land, God said the iniquity wasn't full yet. Now you see it is because of the previous king of Jerusalem, which was Melchizedek, our worship.
Right. Yeah.
And now the king of Hebrew, which is, when you think of Bethel, that's the house of God, and it was sacked along with Ai. So you see that things have got so bad from the patriarchal period to now in the Mosaic age, that you really get the sense of the iniquity of the Amorites, why all the people have to be wiped out.
That's a really good point. Mike talks about how these cities have really over time been really tainted with wickedness. Their original state, or at least from when we knew them, of Melchizedek being in Jerusalem, of Abraham being in Hebron, and Bethel, the house of God, these essentially sacred places, or at least places where phenomenal people, men of God, came from, originated from, or dwelt, and now they've really been contaminated with sin and wickedness. And so this Southern campaign is really cleaning out house and getting a refresh here. Or at least this conquest of the land, not necessarily Southern campaign, but yeah, good point.
I was thinking of the same kind of thing that Michael was saying there about that passage in Genesis about the iniquity of the Amorites not being full. So at that point, God was basically saying, wait, but here, when he's fulfilling this, God is the one calling the shots. So God is the one saying, they need to be destroyed. He's saying, God is saying to them, you destroy them. So
Brent talking about the authority of God being able to make the calls on purifying the land of Canaan. This reminds me of this passage. I don't have this in my notes, and I'll probably reference this a lot just because it's burned in my mind so well. In Hebrews chapter 2, talking about the old law in the time before Christ, in the days of the old law, talking about every transgression in verse 2, halfway through. Every transgression or disobedience received a just retribution. So we see these things like, man, hailstones and hangings and just slaughtering people, men and women and presumably children and AI, and think, that's a lot of people in the world will say, what kind of God would do that? That was just. That was a perfect example, or that was perfect discipline. That was a perfect execution. That was just. It was done exactly the way God wanted to. It wasn't too light. It wasn't too heavy. It was exactly the way it was intended.
Mike, just one more comment on that. When you talk about the children and the adults,
Mm-hmm.
of course, we know that children, they have no sin. So we know exactly where they went. They were guilt-free. But those who were adults, God was judging them. So when maybe an atheist or someone thinks about God's injustice, here's young children. They'd be in a safe relationship with God. The adults, well, God is judging them. He was calling the shots.
Yeah, good point. Brent talking about adults being executed because of God's judgment. It is, and that's what it was. It was their judgment based on their actions and disobedience. And children may perishing in these battles and overtakings of city, being overtaken, and that's really God doing them a favor. Is taking their life so that they'll be in heaven. All right, we'll continue here. We've got some smaller parts that we break up, and we'll see some parts where really can be kind of summarized, a listing of these southern and northern campaign efforts here. So I'm going to read this section from the Waldron's book of verse 28 through 39. They summarize this really quite well, chapter 10. I'm going to read the section if I can find it. Let's see. While the Israelites had the advantage, they made a swing through the cities of the south, defeating them as they came to them. Joshua and his forces took the city of Mecca and wiped out the population. Likewise, he destroyed Libnah and Lachish. The king of Gezer came to the aid of Lachish, but Joshua destroyed him and his armies until there were none left. Eglon, Hebron, and Debir were also destroyed, from Kadesh Barnea to Gibeon. Every enemy was defeated. Joshua was able to destroy all these kings and their armies and many of their cities, because Jehovah, the God of Israel, fought for Israel. After these things, Joshua and Israel returned to Gilgal. So all these cities are listed here in this section from 28 to 39. Getting close to the end of the chapter here. They list 7 cities. That's a number familiar to Bible readers and Christians. And the text, this complete number of 7 cities in the southern campaign. God really is the one delivering the people into the land. We really see this kind of checklist of cities that are just being annihilated and taken care of, listing the kings, if not their names, then just the cities that they ruled over. So who defeated these cities? And it's ultimately God. And to the point that Mike and Brent have made, God is, but Israel had to lift the sword. And the same way, God wins effortlessly, but his people still have to fulfill their role faithfully as warriors. In the same way, if we want to win, God has already won. That's a confusing thing when you're a kid. Well, God's already won, so why do we have to? Well, we still have to lift the sword. We still have to do the work as a Christian. We still have to obey. We still have to give our effort in the same way of Israel, much like Israel having to be that instrument, even though God was obviously the force behind it all. Wrapping up this chapter and 40 through 43. In 40, Joshua struck the whole land, the hill country, and the Negev, and the lowland, and the slopes, and all their kings, and he left none remaining, but devoted the destruction all that breathed, just as the Lord God of Israel commanded. He goes in and talks about the region and geography in verse 41. He kind of lists the boundaries that they took care of. And in verse 42, mentions the kings. And then again, to reiterate what we already said, in verse 42, it says, because the Lord God of Israel fought for Israel. So none of this would have been possible had not been for God. And remember, these are still amateur fighters. They've only got a few wars under their belt. They're all successes. That does not work. You don't go to the major leagues and have never picked up a baseball bat. You know, these are guys who probably can't even wield a sword the right way. But it would be jaw-dropping to see your friend and fellow soldier be killed by someone who's, you know, I don't know, having terrible finesse with a sword. You know, that's what I keep thinking about. It really shows their dependence and faith that they had to have in God. So we'll go through chapter 11 and 12 fairly quickly, both because our time is losing us, but it is also kind of some abbreviated messages here. So the northern campaign, verse 11 through 9. So like I said, verse 1 through 9. Chapter 11 is a lot like 10. 10 is a lot like 9 in that a king gets a bright idea. Hey, let me just get a whole bunch of buddies together and we'll wipe out Gibeon, or we'll wipe out Israel. You think that news would get around that that's not working well, but nevertheless, it's tried again. In chapter 11, we see Jabin, king of Hazor. He came together and he sent for Joab, the king of Madon, and the king of Shimron, the king of Akshaph, king of the Chinnereth, the king of Naphathdor, king of Hermon, king of Mizpah. He gets all these guys together, and the number of the people together were like sand on the seashore, is what Scripture says in verse 4, chapter 11, with very many horses and chariots. And all the kings joined their forces, in verse 5, and came and encamped together at the waters of Merom. So all these guys came together. You know, this is kind of the final big fight here as far as to maintain control. They come from the northern campaign, but also there's a mention of some Philistines and Amorites that kind of trickle in, Hittites and Amorites, that kind of parasites that come in from maybe even the lower region that may have been traveling or something. Some speculate that. And they all come together. And Jabin is, quick note, is probably a title, this king of Hazor, a title given to the king there, much like Pharaoh. Jabin's also mentioned in Judges with Deborah defeating him. So Jabin gathers all these together. And in verse 6, the Lord told Joshua the same message. Do not be afraid of them. Do not be afraid. For tomorrow at this time I will give over all of them slain to Israel. You shall hamstring their horses and burn their chariots afire. So Joshua and all the warriors came suddenly against them by the waters of Merom and fell upon them. Verse 8. And the Lord gave them into the hand of Israel, who struck them and chased them as far as the great Sidon and Mizraphoth Marim and eastward, far from the valley of Mizpeh. And they struck them until he left none remaining. And Joshua did to them just as the Lord had said to him. He hamstrung the horses and burned the chariots with fire. So Joshua is really just this incredible champion for the Lord and fulfilling. This is a great time to be an Israelite. Things are going really well, and it's all because of obedience and faith. And had that not happened, we see what hiccups and issues happened with back at Ai with Achan. So things are going well. They're taking care of things beautifully. And Joshua is being this great commander-in-chief. So always depending on God. We see God said to do this, read down a little bit, Joshua did it to the letter. And it's super encouraging. You see the results from that obedience. Why would they hamstring the horses? Why would they cut the horses?
Slow them down during warfare, according to the Walter.
Yeah, basically just cripples them. They can't really do anything. They can stand around and eat grass. That's really all they're good for after that. So we see that that's another act of faith where they could have taken the goods of the city that they destroy. Horses would have been a really valuable thing to have. But that negates the use of any inhabitant there, but also for the Israelites, where that's your transportation, that's your literal horsepower, that's everything, that's your getting around, that's your power. So they took care of that, and all depending on faith there. Exactly, God didn't want them to rely on horses or chariots. It says the same thing to David, and we see the disobedience of that with Solomon. And we see the wickedness that comes from faith in those physical things of horses and chariots. Yikes. So Hazor being this large city, it was a huge city with massive walls, about 200-acre fortress, compared to Jericho being a 7-acre fortress and 2.5 to Ai. It is the biggest place in town, biggest place in the land with a long history. So Hazor was the only city that was burned, and that was because all these other cities, the Israelites were going to inhabit those cities. Those tribes were going to make them their homes, and the things there were going to be theirs. So they'd have to adjust to that. There's a reference to Deuteronomy 20 where Moses gives them instruction of don't leave anyone breathing. You know, that's really a pointed thing to say. It's really clear. You're going to wipe out everybody, and Joshua fulfills that rule, or that law, that command from Moses and ultimately from God. So these regions, in verse 16 through 23 of chapter 11, these regions are being described and the kings are identified. God hardens their heart to punish the people for their wickedness, and Israel wipes them out. A lot of this is just these last bits of 11 and 12 gives a summary of the cities that they destroyed, and it's just really clear. A checklist of this is the land that God has promised, land that God is giving you, and here's how they're defeating them. Here's what's being taken care of. The Anakim were left in verse 22 of chapter 11. The Anakim were left in Gaza, Gath, and Ashdod, these Philistines. And if you remember, a really famous Anakim from Gath was Goliath. And this is for the tribes were supposed to go through and take care of conquering the land. And Joshua left those people for them to take care of them in the places where they would dwell. In chapter 12, the first half is taking note of it's just a recap of everything we've talked about so far as far as battles. The first half talks about what Moses did with Sihon and Og, that was taken care of on the east side of the Jordan. And then they crossed the Jordan. The priests set their feet on the water stopped, and they carried the Ark of the Covenant first. And all the people went through, they set up the monument, and then Joshua went through Jericho, Ai, all these other places mentioned in this latter half of chapter 12. There were 31 kings in all, 16 in the south and 15 in the north. So Israel now has control over Canaan. But it's these little villages that they'll be having these battles in with the different Philistines. Quick question then would be done. Why did God not just wipe it all out? Why didn't he just clear slate, wipe it all out? Either he do it or they all just go through and pass through the whole land of Canaan and just kill everything all the way through. Why was it in these little stages of villages and rural areas? It's mentioned explicitly in Deuteronomy, I think. So the wild beast won't overtake it. It's strategic. God's using this as strategy to preserve the land and so that they can cultivate the land as the new tenants of Canaan. Thank you for your attention, and I'll look forward to Wednesday night.